This is on 5 memorable Oklahoma governors. Let's start out with the first governor, who was Charles Haskell. I mentioned in the last blurb that the Democrats at that point in time, keeping in mind statehood for Oklahoma came in 1907. The Democrats were largely the Southern Party. Republicans were largely the Northern Party. But as in every case, there's an exception to the rule. There were many exceptions back then, not just one or a few. Our first governor, Charles Haskell, was a largely conservative Democrat, but he was from Ohio. He was from the North or the upper Midwest. And Charles Haskell was an incredible man. Prior to becoming governor, he had established himself first in Ohio as a successful and very innovative businessman. Then he came to Oklahoma with a pioneer spirit, looking for opportunities here, and built up from scratch a great success as a business person, multiple companies. He was in transportation, railroads, banking, a variety of different things. You can look at his pictures, especially when he was a young man. He was a very handsome man, apparently had a lot of charisma, but he had more than that. He wasn't just a telegenic, before the days of television, politician. This was a man of substance, a man who was brilliant, a man who was a leader. He was able to pull together people to accomplish tasks and efforts and movements and accomplishments that helped the many. And so no doubt that was one reason that he grew into prominence during the statehood, the Constitutional Convention, which was the constitutional meeting, putting together the Constitution in 1906, that would be the working document in the law of the land of Oklahoma when it became a state in 1907. Once Haskell became governor in 1907, our first governor, in the first place, he was a leader. You can imagine this was a challenge, a new state with already a large population. We talked about that Oklahoma was by far the largest populated territory at the time of its becoming a state of any state in the Union in the history of the United States. Over 1.6 million people, upwards of 2 million people. That's a lot larger than most states or many states in today's America. So it took leadership to pull together this large group of people with greatly diverse views on everything, and even diversity of geography that come from so many different places. One of the things that I think is memorable about Haskell, in addition to just the leadership of the new state and getting us on a track to be a success, was that there was a banking crisis almost immediately in Oklahoma. It was right around the time of statehood. In fact, I think it actually started right before we became a state, November 16, 1907. It was an offshoot of a national crisis, the Panic of 1907. You can Google that and find more about that. There was a nationwide crisis, and it hit home in Oklahoma. You can imagine, with a lot of poor people, a new state, very undeveloped or underdeveloped infrastructure, that there were not that many banks in place, and this financial crisis swept Oklahoma. Charles Haskell, in the way that we look back now and realize what was his way, his brilliant, cool and calm leadership in the midst of crisis. He actually called upon friends and associates that he knew, not just in Oklahoma, but in other cities that were larger in the same general part of the country, such as Kansas City and St. Louis. And he was able to pull together funds and resources, capital, to help Oklahoma's banks that were in crisis. And you can read more about that in my Oklahoma history book. It's either in chapter 11 or chapter 12, the banking crisis. Columbia National Bank was the big one. And anyway, he was able to pull together the necessary funds and resources and marshal the support so that the state's banks and the state itself did not collapse hardly before we even started as a state. So Charles Haskell, remember him. William B. Alfalfa Bill Murray. Alfalfa Bill is, I think, the easy way to remember him. He was a leader in the state from long before statehood. During the territorial days, he came up across Red River from Texas. He was a Texas native from Toadsuck, Texas. No kidding. And he married a beautiful Chickasaw woman, Alicia Johnston, I believe, niece of the head of the Chickasaw tribe at the time. And again, Murray was a brilliant man. He was 6'4" tall, raw boned, looked every bit the frontiersman and the cowboy. Talked like it, looked like it, was a rough-hewn character, a rough sheriff in town. But that's what it seemingly took to kind of help lead this brawling and rollicking new state. We've already talked about in class how it was a violent state in so many ways. Again, we love our frontier heritage. We love our pioneer heritage. There's a lot of great things about that. But one of the things that's kind of, dicey about that is it's a rough bunch of people. So anyway, Alfalfa Bill was a man of his time. He not only participated as a delegate in the Constitutional Convention that framed the Constitution for the state of Oklahoma, but he was the head of it. He was the speaker. He had the gavel. And in our Oklahoma history book, my book, The Oklahomans, you can see that 2-page spread that's a photo of the Constitutional Convention as they were meeting. And you can see him on the left side of that picture standing at the podium, leading, guiding, and helping move forward that convention toward crafting a constitution. Well, he was indeed a rough-hewn character. He had quite a career in politics and leadership in Oklahoma. He became a United States congressman a couple of times after he was Speaker of the Constitutional Convention. He finally lost in that and was turned out of office. He ran for governor, lost that. Took a group of people to Bolivia. He said, well, to heck with it, I'm going to go pioneer someone else. They were down in Bolivia during the 1920s trying to establish a new colony, if you will. That didn't work out. Eventually, he came back, ran for governor. He'd lost twice, finally ran a third time and won. His message of helping the common person as the Depression came on in the early 1930s, as the agricultural difficulties of Oklahoma took root even before that in the especially late 1920s, but after World War I, his message resonated with people. He was for the common person, but he was an inveterate arch opponent of Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal. And that marked a lot of the remainder of his career, was opposing Roosevelt's New Deal in Oklahoma. He ran against Roosevelt in the 1932 Democratic presidential primary, lost to Roosevelt, and kind of became then an elder statesman in Oklahoma. He ran for a couple of more offices, did not win again. And of course, probably I think the most criticized, rightfully, thing about Alfalfa Bill Murray was he definitely had some old views on race. I think it's clear when you read his writings that whether it was African Americans or Jewish Americans, a lot of different groups, he was not huge fans of them. He wasn't intending to be unkind to them. He just thought they were not of an equivalent level to, I guess, the white race. And of course, as we've talked about in class, that's a sad feature of our state history, especially early on. And but I would say, not in defense of Murray, but somewhat in explanation that his views it wasn't like he stood out like he would today if he had those views in Oklahoma as an arch racist. These were views that were sadly held by probably the majority of the white population of Oklahoma, and even the Native American population of Oklahoma had a view that they looked somewhat down on the African Americans at that time in history. So As we talked about in class, when you get into issues of race and those types of things, ethnicity, that can be tough stuff to talk about. I hope I've been fair as I presented it, but I certainly want to make clear that and not gloss over the fact that the history of our state, even some of the great men, great in other ways, had racial views that today we would consider unfortunate. Okay, so moving on to Leon Phillips, who was a University of Oklahoma football player around the time of World War I, around 1916. A big, strapping, red-headed guy, very brilliant man, had quite a temper, which I guess is kind of in keeping of the caricature of the redhead. He certainly had one, but he again was a leader and a person that folks respected and admired and trusted. He got into the state legislature in Oklahoma, late 1920s, early 1930s, worked his way up to Speaker of the House. That means he was the legislative leader in Oklahoma. Then he ran for and became governor in 1938. And for the next 4 years, 1939 through 43, led the state as governor. One of the memorable things about Phillips was he had this tenacious intent that the people of Oklahoma would not be in debt, that they would not leave indebtedness to their children and grandchildren. In other words, that the state legislature would not pay for or would not commit itself to a bunch of expenses, whether it be new roads, whether it be new buildings, programs that in and of themselves might be good, but if there wasn't money to pay for them, he knew that the children and the grandchildren, the people making those decisions, would be the ones that would ultimately have to pay for it. So he helmed the effort, which was a contentious battle that went on for many months across the state of Oklahoma, using the medium of radio, the newspapers and all, to carry their messages as to whether there would be a balanced budget amendment in the state of Oklahoma. There were many people that were against that. I would say, fortunately, many more people were for it. That is, Phillips wanted written into law that the state legislature could not spend 1 cent more, could not commit the state to 1 cent more of expenditure than it had budgeted, that they actually had money from the taxpayers to pay for. And after a long and heated battle, Phillips won that contest. And to this very day, we have this balanced budget amendment. And that's one reason why our current legislature is still flailing around in this special session, is because they are not allowed, thanks to Leon Phillips, to spend more money than they have. Oh, that the United States government could come up with such a rule, right? Okay, next, Raymond Gary, 1950s. This was a very conservative Christian man. He was a rancher from the south part of the state, from Durant. The thing that there are a number of things remain in my memory about him. He was a very morally upright man. He would refuse to meet with women alone. He would not travel without his male secretary or someone else. He wanted always there to be a witness that he was upright, that he was conducting himself as he should be. And again, we think in this day and time that there are a lot of other politicians, a lot of other leaders in our country that should follow such a practice. It would probably be difficult for them to do that. But for Raymond Gary, he was a man without stain, a man above reproach. Thing I most remember about him is that he was the man that stood up. We've talked about the issue of civil rights and how that played into, especially beginning in the era of conflict in Oklahoma. Raymond Gary was a conservative Christian white man in a position of power, and yet he stood up. Not in 2017, but in the 1950s, he stood up and said that things such as that America talks about how it's a land of equality, how our Constitution burnishes that into our law and our history, and the other nations laugh at us and mock at us because we apparently preach one thing and we practice another. Of course, what he was referring to was at that time, still in the 1950s, Jim Crow, African Americans segregated in so many places still at that point in time. Restaurants, movie theaters, water fountains, and so forth. Couldn't try on clothes. They could buy clothes in department stores, couldn't try them on. How sad when we look back on that. Raymond Gary moved the ball way down the field in the civil rights movement in Oklahoma from his position as governor. He used his power for the benefit of not just the people, but the voiceless people, the people that did not have political power. And it's very clear that Clara Luper and others that were in the forefront of the civil rights movement in Oklahoma in the 1950s and 1960s benefited greatly from Governor Raymond Gary, from his high position of power, opening the door and getting the conversation going among white folks and white folks in positions of power about rights for African Americans. Finally, Frank Keating, a more recent governor, 1995 to 2003. This was a man who will figure so prominently in Volume 2 of my Oklahoma history book because he was in the forefront of Oklahoma history across many of the last many decades, 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. He's currently on the Board of Regents at the University of Oklahoma, but going all the way back to the early 1970s as a state senator in Oklahoma. He was in the forefront. In fact, he actually introduced legislation to impeach a governor, David Hall, who wound up going to prison for crimes that he committed before and during, or I believe it was during his time in the governor's house. Well, so Frank Keating is still in his late 20s, was already making a mark. Frank Keating had been an FBI agent. He'd been educated at Georgetown University. This is a very brilliant man. I'm a little biased, I have to admit, perhaps because he wrote the foreword to our Oklahoma history book that y'all have. But I don't think I'm really biased because an objective look at Frank Keating, he was not only a great leader for our state, but he got so many programs initiated that I believe were for the good of the state. Right to work laws, laws that helped the climate in Oklahoma be friendlier to business so that we could keep and draw companies and not lose them to places like Texas and other states, as had been happening so often before his term as governor. And of course, maybe most memorably was his leadership during the Oklahoma City bombing and afterwards. I'll close with a story that I think is very special that I heard at a men's group one time at my church. A former police officer from Norman talked about how this police officer was working right after the bombing. It was either the night of the bombing or the next night, and this guy was on Broadway, just a couple of blocks north of the bombing, at 2 in the morning. It was still a very dangerous place. You could smell gas fumes. Power lines were hanging down the streets. And here comes Governor Frank Keating walking down the middle of Broadway at 2 in the morning, encouraging the emergency responders and finding out what help they needed. And I get a little choked up here, but I think a little bit of a testament to the humility of this man. When I mentioned this to him one time, of course, he didn't even remember the event, didn't even remember the occasion. But I'll tell you what, this career Norman police officer, police captain, certainly remembered it. And he swears by Frank Keating, and so do I. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.